All right, so picking back up again with Hegel's philosophy of right, and having explained the basic idea framework, um, the way in which dialectical movement produces reality, and the sense in which reality is the production of content to fulfill an abstract idea. Uh, we can now think about the idea of right in general, right? Uh, so Hegel says the moral philosophy has as its central object of investigation what he calls the idea of right. And the idea of right is this abstract idea. It is a universal concept of right that will be applicable to all people in all cases. Right? And in that sense, it's going to be more or less along the same lines as Kant's idea of a moral law, right? Something that is universal and an absolute for all people in all cases. Uh, Now, again, right, the difference between Kant and Hegel is going to be in what our relation to the idea of right is. For Kant, the idea of right, the moral law, is grasped immediately through reason. Right? Uh, I can understand the moral law simply through reflection on the rational structure of action. So that in order to know what is moral, in order to know what the moral thing to do is, I only need to have knowledge of the categorical imperative, the moral law, which will tell me, right, in all cases, what I ought to do categorically. So that the content, as it were, of the moral law for Kant is identical to its form, right? Uh, what is the content of moral action? Anything that uh, conforms to the abstract moral law. In other words, there is nothing in particular, nothing practical that I can do, but anything that meets the formal requirements of morality will count as morality, right? Uh, if it can be universalized, right? If it can fit the form of universality, then it's moral. Hegel has a different idea, right? Which is that the content of the idea of right is not irrelevant, right? That that practical side of morality is not just about following the abstract law, the idea of right. Instead, right, and it's also for Hegel, importantly, not that the idea of right can be grasped through pure reason alone, through reflection. Uh, that anyone at any time uh, could arrive at the moral law simply through rational logical means. Instead, for Hegel, the idea the idea of right can only really be understood once its form, right, the abstract concept, has been fulfilled through practical action. In other words, uh, we don't know the idea of right until we have already gone through this whole dialectical process of attempting to fulfill the idea of right. And that process is historical. And so for Kant, uh, the idea itself is always available, but the practical world is always out of sync with the moral law. And the only way to bring the moral law into existence is to ignore all practical concerns. Uh, for Hegel, the idea of right is not available in itself through pure reason. Because in order to arrive at a genuine idea of right, at the true idea of right, we first have to pass through all of the practical moments, the moments of externality, of objectification, uh, and of negativity that are essential to revealing, to realizing the idea of right. So I don't want to belabor this point too much again, but Hegel will say, right, this is the problem of historical era, that for every historical era, and similarly for every individual, there is some concept of right, obviously. And each individual's concept of right and each historical era's moment of right will be a piece of the idea of right itself. Uh, However, no historical era or individual as yet has a complete concept of the idea of right because uh, right has not been fully manifested in the world anywhere. You can't know the idea of right until it is manifested in the world. Uh, until you've passed through all of these moments in the dialectic, right? And this is the sort of beauty of the dialectic. You have to have the practical realm in order to have the ideal realm, um, so that the whole the whole of human history is the development of the content of the idea of right. Right? You can't know what the idea is until it's been fully manifested, and history is the history of the manifestation of the idea of right. And with each new historical era, uh, it is manifested in a higher, more real and fuller way, progressing up to, the inevitable telos end, where the idea of right is in fact fully manifested in the external physical world, right? Where the inner idea of right is reaches complete penetration, complete interpenetration with the world, right? The external objective world. So, what we are always dealing with when we're asking about the nature of right is this negotiation between the idea of right in itself, right, which always lies over the horizon, right, which we don't have a clear view of, which we don't see in itself per se, but rather we find reflected in, fracted in our localized ideas of right, those ideas of right that are particular to our individuality and our particular historical era. Uh, and so we constantly have what Hegel calls a mere concept of right, which is the idea of right as it is determined uh, within the particularity of us as individuals or the particularity of our historical era. And this mere concept is both the right sort of guide that points us toward the absolute idea of right, but also um, might prove a stumbling block for our progressing toward that absolute right. Right? We may believe that our concept of right is the concept of right, uh, and therefore fail to realize that there is there are subsequent moments in the dialectic that we've yet to realize. Right? So the mere idea of right uh, can't be confused with the absolute idea of right, but also we can't glimpse the absolute idea of right except through our mere ideas of right. Right. So a concept of morality that is, uh, historically particular. Um, is necessary and true and real insofar as it expresses the degree of development that has been reached in that historical era or within that individual. And that realness and truth of right might, right, tempt us to uh, not push any further. Um, but the fact that there are these particular uh, true and real concepts of right that exist from in one historical period or one individual does not mean that there isn't some higher and absolute idea of right that will be genuinely universal. So in class I was struggling to think of an example of a historically particular concept of right, and you know um, I think probably the most obvious example would have to do with um, racism and slavery, right? Particularly because those are so those phenomena are so related to freedom. Uh, Hegel says the idea of right is freedom. The idea of right is freedom. The question is, what does freedom look like? How do we actually achieve freedom in the practical world? So, if we think back, or if we imagine, right, that the year is 1865, 1866, right at the end of, after the end of the American Civil War, we could imagine thinking, we have achieved right, right? because our concept of right and our concept of freedom is constrained by our historical circumstances. Uh, Freedom means the abolition of slavery. Um, right means uh, the acknowledgement, at least, that uh, the enslaved people should not be enslaved. That Black people are not. That it's wrong to enslave uh, Black Americans. During this time, right, it would have been, and there were many who believed we have achieved right. Right has been satisfied. Uh, and they would have been absolutely correct, right? That the end of slavery is an incredibly important moment in the realization of the idea of freedom, universal freedom, in the practical realm. However, right, so you might, if it's 1866, you might say, all right, all done. The world is right. And you wouldn't be wrong, right? But it's also true, then, that the dialectic is not over. And this moment of freedom is going to meet a subsequent moment of uh, constraint of freedom, right? Its own moment of negativity, uh, its own moment of, right, objectification and sort of, yeah, again, negativity or wearing away. And so we can think of that as, right, the destruction of the Reconstruction era, the beginning of the Jim Crow era. Right, we go back and forth. So you have the end of slavery and Reconstruction, but then you get the moment of negativity, the next dialectical moment, which would be the institution of Jim Crow and other forms, different forms of oppression, and right, the taking away of freedom, and then a return again to a positive moment, a push toward freedom, which would be the civil rights movement, and the Voting Rights Act and things like that in the mid 20th century. And so, the point is that the concept of right in 1866 is absolutely right and true, but it's only partial, right? It's a mere concept, and it's a mere concept because it is tied to its historical era, its historical circumstances. And so, right, then we move further down the dialectic. We have, the reaction, the backlash, the antithesis to the thesis of abolition and freedom. And we have to go through these moments, right, from a Hegelian perspective, in order to arrive then at the civil rights movement and the Voting Rights Act and the other, the end of segregation. And I think, again, from a Hegelian perspective, it would be we could certainly make the argument that the fullness of the freedom that is achieved through the civil rights era is richer, more real than the freedom that is achieved through merely the abolition of slavery. Not to say that one is more significant than the other. That's not really the point. The point is that the concept of freedom and what it really means for freedom to be manifested in the practical realm becomes richer and fuller the more it develops. Right? So that perhaps the actual degree, that more freedom was achieved through abolition than through the Civil Rights Act, right, or era. The difference between being enslaved and not being enslaved is a more extreme and profound difference than uh, the freedom, the change from voting under Jim Crow laws and voting after the Civil Rights Act. That the degree of freedom achieved is lesser. But the more important point would be that the concept of freedom, what it really means to be free, is richer, fuller, and deeper. Right? We understand what freedom means more. It's not enough just to not be enslaved. Right? That true freedom means being able to participate in government. Right? Being able to, buy a house without being subjected to predatory loans, redlining, and all of the sort of array of racist policies that came under fire in the civil rights era. The concept of freedom that's developed there is richer and fuller. Um, but the point I'm trying to make here now is, right, that in both cases, what we have is a mere concept, a concept determined by its historicality. And that all of these point toward the idea itself, but none of them fully express it. And we can see that now, right? So after the Civil Rights Act, we have the reactionary moment that we're living through right now. And so this is sort of, we could think of the optimism of Hegel, right? Is that whenever you have this pushback against, in this case, civil rights, that is a moment of negativity, a moment in the dialectic which foretells a new and higher moment of positivity, right? That whatever will come about as a result of sort of resurgence of racism and oppression and reactionary racial politics of our moment, whatever comes out of this will provide us with yet a higher and fuller concept of freedom again. Okay, so the distinction between a mere idea and the idea itself. Now, what is really happening here with this distinction is the distinction between that abstract idea and the idea as it's manifested. Right? The abstract idea of right is manifested in a certain form within an historical era. And the manifestation of the idea of right is the basis for the mere concept of the idea of right. Right? And so this distinction between the manifestation of the idea and the idea itself is also the distinction between the content of the idea and the abstract form of the idea. So the form of the idea has this content in this moment, this historical moment, and a different, more developed content in another historical moment. And so, if we try to fit all these pieces together, we'd say that the individual in any historical era has the obligation, rational, moral, we might say spiritual in the sense of Geist, geistic, responsibility um, to not just manifest the mere concept of right as it's understood within a historical period, but also then to uh, push that mere concept of right and the degree of content of right manifested to a higher level. The engine of the dialectical movement is the individual and the collection of individuals acting as species, humanity, right, which is the historical subject of morality. Um, so that the engine of all this and what gives us both uh, the manifestation of the mere concept and that which will propel us beyond the concept of our historical age, what makes history move, is the will, right? And the will for Hegel is um, is a key term that right, the will is free. It is the freedom of the will that gives it the possibility of pushing beyond that mere concept of right, gives it the possibility of manifesting right. How is right manifested? Through the will, right? And this is not Kant's idea, right? That the will binds itself to the moral law, and that point of the will is to be good, right? To have good motive, to be motivated by the moral law, and that when it actually comes to creating a world that is in correspondence to the moral law, the will is powerless. No, for Hegel, the will is that power that creates the content that makes the idea of right legible, understandable. So that both the intellectual content, the intellectual idea of right, and the physical manifestation of right in the world are both products of the world, of the will, excuse me. So on page 35, he says, the will without freedom is an empty word. Right? Uh, we can't imagine the will without freedom. It makes no sense to talk about the will as anything other than free. And this freedom must be active in both the intellectual and the physical realm. Because what is freedom for Kant really? And what is this freedom of the will that he mentions? It's just the freedom to choose between being determined by physical causes and being determined by ideal causes, by the moral law. And for Hegel, this is not real freedom, right? Because in that case, the will is never actually the producer of anything. The will is, like the lever on train tracks that decides which track the train will go down. Right? Will it go down the ideal path of the moral law, or the practical realm determined by physical laws? And all the will is is flipping the switch. Right? Which track does the train go down? It doesn't build the track, and it doesn't make the train go. And for Hegel, freedom has to be productive. It means, right, creation, being a cause. Um, and so, again, on page 35, Hegel says that the will is thinking, translating itself into existence. Right? The will has to be both intellectual and physical. It has to be right, aimed ultimately at the complete interpenetration of thinking and existence. Right? And that word existence is the German word Dasein, and it refers to, sort of in Hegel's sense, um, what is there, right? The current form of existence in this historical period, not existence, um, in the sense of universal being. The word Dasein has a rich history, but Hegel's use here is specific, and it means right, that existence that is current, that is real. The German word Dasein refers to, or is a combination of two words, right? Sein, which means to be, and da, which is there. So literally, right, being there, what is there. Now, this idea that the will is thinking, translating itself into existence is a fascinating idea. And it's related to this distinction again between the abstract idea of right and the particular manifestation of that idea in the real world. How is the will translating thinking into existence? Um, this is what action is. I mean, it's kind of the common sense conception of action. I have an idea about what to do, and then I do it. Right? I make it real. My idea becomes real through action. Now, Kant makes this really complicated. Right? How can ideas ever influence the chain of causes that is determined by physical laws? How can anything intellectual ever enter into the physical realm? For Hegel, because in reality, in the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality, there is interpenetration between these two. The divide that would make it impossible to imagine thinking being translated into existence doesn't exist. But still, the concept of translating thinking into existence is a strange and interesting idea. I think the bigger thought here is that this is, again, right, the manner in which it's possible to imagine that absolute idea could ever reach that complete interpenetration with the existing world, with existence. The only way such a thing could occur is if they are synthesized, right? If idea and existence are synthesized. And so the will is that which synthesizes idea and physicality. And we see this really plainly in art or any kind of building, really. Right? That the transformation of material according to some design or plan or idea is the translation of an idea into existence. Um, right. So the will is the engine that drives the dialectic, and it drives the dialectic by translating thinking into existence. Again, on page 35, he writes the distinction between thought and will is simply that between theoretical and practical attitudes. They are not two separate faculties. On the contrary, the will is a particular way of thinking, thinking translating itself into existence, thinking as a drive to give itself existence. So that what the world is, right? What's the distinction between uh, the world and the planets, the world and nature, the world and being? The world is a human world. Uh, Sorry, I'm looking for a quote really quickly. Um, the world is the human world. Uh, Nature is the non-human world. Um, the world is the built world, the organized world, the world of human activity. The world then is nature infused with human spirit. Uh, the global world of society, of government, of the family, uh, the individual's dwelling are all worldly. Um, and what makes them worldly is the addition of human thinking, that they are the product of thinking translated into existence. Um, and so we can imagine that in Hegel's framework, the ultimate conclusion to history will be making all of being part of the world. The complete suffusion of being with human spirit. This complete suffusion of nature with human spirit. The complete interpenetration of nature and human spirit. Uh, so he says that society exists as a kind of second nature within existence. Uh, and it's on page 42. Um, and this second nature is that world that has been translated from thinking. Now, I have gotten into a little tangent here about the world, but the key idea here is that right is manifested through the world, and the world is a manifestation itself of right. The development of the world, the progression of the world is driven by this will translating more and more of the idea of right into existence, making the world more and more in line with the idea of right itself. So, excuse me. Okay. Now, We went over this in class a little bit, but I want to mention it again because it relates to this idea of will and uh, the way the will itself progresses dialectically. Uh, the will of an individual progresses dialectically. And this is the movement between um, right, the absolute indeterminacy of the I and the determination of the I. Back and forth between indeterminacy of the I, of the subject, of myself, and my drive to determine myself as something. Right? So we begin as an I, as a will, in this moment of negativity, what Hegel calls negative freedom. Right? We can remember from the, again, utilitarian lecture, this distinction between positive and negative freedom. The I is this pure negativity. It is indeterminate. It is indeterminacy. And there is enormous freedom in this indeterminacy. However, right, what the will is this drive to translate thinking into existence. And so this I that is of indeterminacy is also a will. And the will desires to act, right? To translate itself into existence. In fact, it has no choice but to translate itself into existence because it exists, right? I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. And it's that second part, the being, that requires that the will determine itself, take on some content. So we move from this determinacy, this negative freedom of not being anything, to a positive moment, right? And in that positive moment, the will latches onto something. It says, I am this. And in latching onto that thing, whatever it might be, it gives itself content, it gives itself determination, and it gives itself kind of positive freedom, right? Positive freedom to be X, to be this thing. And that positive freedom is going to be higher than the negative freedom, right? Because the will translates itself into something. It is now the thing that it thinks itself, it now also is. As pure indeterminacy, right? The will cannot translate itself into being, into existence, because everything that exists is determinate. So the freedom that's gained through this determination is the freedom to act as something. Right? If we think again about the sort of silly example of the musician, right? It's only after I determine myself as a musician that I'm able to act, that I'm able to go out and do something, to objectify myself and set this dialectic in motion. So this positive and negative freedom. And the I is always going through this back and forth between positive and negative freedom, the movement of the dialectic. All right, so I want to touch on, well, there are a few more things I would have liked to touch on, but we're running out of time. But the first would be to lay out a little bit of the idea of right as it exists in society, the way that it's manifested. And this is in section 3. Hegel says, right is in general positive through A, its form having validity within a particular state. Okay, so what is the form of right? We know that the idea of right is freedom. So, right is positive. There's positive freedom when the form of right has validity within a particular state. And he goes on to say that the form of right is found in law. And so we can think again about Kant. Um, there are formal necessities for morality. For Kant, that's really all there are. That we follow the one true law. For Hegel, right, there will be many different manifestations of the form of right, but the form will always be law. So that uh, the form of right in general is law. In each historical moment, the concept of right is enacted formally as law. So again, if we go back to our example, we'd say the idea of right is freedom, and uh, what happens, in the Civil War with the end of slavery, is the recognition that the form of right, the laws having to do with right, are not valid. Right? The law of the land uh, does not conform to the idea of right, our concept of right, and therefore the law needs to change. Right? So that the victory of right at the end of slavery is to create a valid form of right within that historical moment. So now it is law that slavery is illegal. And the form of right for that historical period is now valid. It is in line with our concept of right. So the law is the form of right. And the first sort of the major consideration in translating the idea of right into existence is to create valid forms, right? Valid laws that are in correspondence with our concept of right. So he says, law validates right by giving it a universal form. But B, secondly, right is in general positive through, right is positive in content, not form, but content. So right is positive in content through, he says, the national character, the stage of historical development, and the whole context of natural necessity. Uh, so, right, this is interesting. Again, form and content. The law can be valid, but whether or not there is actually positive right within an historical era and society is not just about the law. Right? This is, really important point. Maybe obvious, but maybe not. That just having good laws is not enough. And why? Because human laws are arbitrary to some extent, right? What grounds the human law is simply humanity, right? As he says, national character, the stage of historical development. So, we maybe would want to flag this sort of nationalism of Hegel here, the fact that he's conceiving of this in nationalistic terms. There's no question about that. Hegel is a nationalist. Um, there are ways to interpret Hegel's philosophy of right as essentially a large justification for the nation state. And maybe we can get into that a little bit more. We'll certainly have an opportunity to talk about nations more this semester. But I think it's worth noting, right, that how is Hegel's idea of right, um, a product of his historical era? How is his abstract, absolute idea of right perhaps only really a mere concept of right? We might say, well, it's constrained by the idea of the nation state. Right? The nation state is a kind of necessary political form, and that he's thinking always within the context of the nation state. The nation state is this pinnacle of historical political development for Hegel. And we would say, well, it doesn't maybe look like that's going to be true, right? The nation state may itself only be a stage of historical development that we will pass beyond. Um, but, right, we can maybe leave out the idea of, national character and instead think about the character of the people who are submitted to or submit themselves to the law, right, more generally. And here, Hegel's putting his finger on an important tension. Right? That the law, we move beyond laws, as we see in the example of the Civil War. And what allows us to move beyond laws is the extent to which the national character, character of a people or society, is out of sync with the moral law, or with the law, the political law. And this could happen one of two ways, right? That the law runs ahead of the people, or the people run ahead of the law. That we would establish laws that, establish an idea of right that has not been embraced, manifested, and realized in people, individuals, the actual society, and that therefore society would, chafe at these laws. And we can think of, again, sort of like environmentalism. If we were to say, it is now illegal to burn fossil fuels. Well, we could certainly make the argument that that is a valid form of right, right? That law would manifest an idea of right at a formal level. But the national character, the actual sort of moral content of the country, would not be in line with that law. Right? We aren't at a stage where we're ready to have that kind of law. So the national character, the stage of historical development, the whole context of natural necessity, right? That law might be justified formally, but with respect to content, it's not, because the people aren't ready for it. We haven't reached the stage of historical development at which the law is going to be a good law, is going to match the content of the people, and also that law is going to be out of sync with the whole context of natural necessity. Again, this is in section 3. And what that would mean to not be in line with the whole context of natural necessity would be to say, well, yes, maybe this is a good law in theory, strictly speaking, formally. But if it became illegal tomorrow to burn fossil fuels, we would all, right, immediately become criminals. And so it's an impossibility, right? The context of natural necessity, the sort of order of things, the way the world works, can't be brought in line with a law like that. So the law has to reflect the content um, that it legislates. The form has to match the content. But it would also be possible for it to happen the other way, right? That the national character, stage of development, context of natural necessity would race ahead of the law. And we might think that this is what happens in the Civil War, right? That uh, the national character could no longer tolerate this old law that legalized slavery, right? And so the law, in that case, had to catch up with the stage of historical development that the people itself had reached. Right? That the idea of freedom had been translated into the national character, into society, manifests itself in society in such a way that a higher degree of the idea of freedom is present there than is found in the law itself. So the law and the content need to match each other. And the final thing I'll say today, because we're out of time, is that this idea then gets picked up in later sections of the philosophy of right to make the case that uh, when understanding or manifesting the idea of right, um, one always has to do that both with the abstract concept of right itself in mind, but also through one's individuality, through one's particularity, right? Uh, that the universal and infinite idea of universality can and must be expressed through the finitude and particularity of the individual. And the ultimate manifestation of right will not, again, erase the individual or the particular, but will be completely synthesized with the particular. So the universal idea of right will be manifested uh, validly and appropriately in different ways for each individual. And this, I think, is really sort of the beauty of Hegel's concept of right here. That no matter how abstract and absolute and universal our idea of right, uh, we can never hope and should never desire to do away with the particularity of the individual. Um, yeah. Okay, so we'll leave it at that for today, and we'll pick it up again on Monday. Uh, all right. Until then.